welcome you to come and sit down. My name's Tim Dalrymple. I'm the president and CEO of Christianity Today. Prior to that, I led a creative agency for 6 years. Prior to that, launched a business enterprise known as Patheos.com. And prior to that, I was an academic in the field of philosophy of religion. And it's a real honor for me to be here with Marvin Olasky. Marvin has written, I think, 29 books or something along that order. Marvin has had a fascinating career. I'll sit down in just a minute. But Marvin has had a fascinating career as a political philosopher, cultural commentator, also an academic at places like UT Austin for many years, and one of the real legends of the contemporary Christian media marketplace, in particular journalism. And so we're going to be talking about the present, the past, present, and future of journalism and journalistic media. And we're really honored to have Marvin here to talk with us about this. And part of why I'm excited to do this is Marvin played a role in my shift into media and journalism as well. And maybe I'll come back to that later. But Marvin, your undergrad was at Yale, your PhD in American culture was at University of Michigan, and then you established kind of an academic perch, and yet somewhere along the way you discerned a call to journalism and journalistic media. Can you walk us through that process? I'd love for folks to get to know you a little bit better.
Well, sure. The call actually started very early, coming out of curiosity and the journalistic opportunity to get to places I otherwise wouldn't be able to go to. It really started in high school. We had a fire in our high school, and it was fun to be able to have my student press pass and go behind the police lines and see the actual burning stuff going on. So that was exciting. In college, and this dates me, this is way back in the Vietnam War years, the US military at that point tried to burn down the forest of Vietnam in order to be able to bomb North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers. And in the process used a chemical called Agent Orange that had carcinogenic effects, both on born and unborn people. And very few people knew about it, but there was a chemistry professor at Yale who had actually developed this during World War II. So I had heard this from him. I could call the Pentagon and ask, with some specific chemical information, how does this work? Why are you doing this? What's happening? And they actually responded. So there's my call of being able to go behind the police lines and see fires, call the Pentagon and get information. The day after I graduated from college, I had never been more than 100 miles from the Atlantic Ocean, and so I started bicycling across the country to Oregon and was able to write about what I was seeing, so that was fun. In Oregon, I was able to work on a small newspaper and go to cattle drives and stuff like that. Came back to Boston and was able to interview Portuguese immigrants working in factories and mills. So it was really the excitement of being able to go to places, see cultures I knew nothing about, and just learning all the way. A great educational opportunity and tons of fun.
So how did you see the relationship between your academic work and your journalistic work? Because you did both for a very substantial period of your life.
Well, I had worked on newspapers before getting a PhD, and then taught and came to UT in 1983 and was teaching journalism history and learning that basically American journalistic history up until the middle part of the 19th century is essentially Christian journalistic history. The newspapers and magazines were explicitly Christian, covering news, but trying to explain theology at the same time. And from that point, I wrote a book called Prodigal Press, basically because American journalism is the prodigal son of Christianity in lots of ways. May have strayed far from it, but that got me into thinking more about journalism, wanting to do it. I had already been a newspaper columnist at various times, but there was a small magazine in North Carolina called World Magazine that a wonderful guy named Joel Bells had started in 1986. And it was struggling. In 1990, he asked me to join the board, And in 1992, a couple of the board members at a meeting said, hey, we're losing money on this. We have to stop publishing, at which point I could have my Jimmy Stewart, Mr. Smith, It's a Wonderful Life moment, basically saying, you can't do this. This is a very exciting thing in journalism. There hasn't been anything like this going for 150 years or so. We can't stop it. And they said, okay, you can keep going, but you have to become the editor. And that's what I started doing at that point for 29 years. Again, lots of fun, living in Austin, through the kindness of Texas taxpayers, by which professors only have to teach 6 hours a week. I had time to edit the magazine. It became, in some ways, a professional family. We had interns living with us in our house. We had about 32 interns over the years living with us for anywhere from 2 months to 12 months. World, a struggling enterprise, did not have an HR department like Christianity Today has, because otherwise I don't think an HR department would allow this. People actually living in your house, most of whom were young ladies, but I basically was like an Orthodox rabbi, not even shaking hands, making that very clear. And they became almost like professional family members. Had a great time there for 29 years, and covering all sorts of stuff, being able to travel around and write from about 80 different countries. So again, I would like to be able to say that in some ways journalism was a deeply spiritual calling for me, and in some ways it became that. But basically I got into this because it was fun and gave me the opportunity to go all over the place and meet lots of interesting people and learn lots of stuff. A wonderful life of exploration and learning.
So you say that it became more of a spiritual vocation as time went on. Can you say a little bit about how you've come to view the vocation of the Christian journalist specifically? Maybe you could say a little bit about the journalist, period, and then the Christian journalist and how you think about that calling and what does it mean to be a Christian journalist that might be the same or might be different from a journalist in general.
Well, sure. American journalism history has a number of phases. Early on, the reporters and editors tried to report both material things and spiritual things. Now, of course, the spiritual things are invisible. You can't report some of this currently going on as fact in the way you could actually report something that you see right in front of you, but they would ask people about their spiritual experiences and quote people and have people tell stories about what they had gone through. And so the work of the journalist was basically to cover both material and spiritual. Again, different ways, but nevertheless, taking both of these as real and taking people's experience very seriously, and then trying to apply the Bible and developing a sense of journalism ethics, a sense of truth-telling, a sense of standing up against government officials at times. A quick story, and then I want to ask you some things, Tim, but a quick story. There was a New York newspaper editor named John Peter Zenger in the 1730s who reported in his newspaper that the royal governor of New York was stealing lands from the Native Americans, was stealing cows, was a very corrupt person, and he reported that. Now, this was something that was really weird in journalism, because the job of journalists basically was to do public relations for the king or for the royal governor, to make the king or the royal governor look good. And here John Peter Zenger, who was a devout Christian, was actually telling the truth. So he ended up in jail for 8 months, and then he came to court, and his lawyer made an extraordinary claim. At that point in British law, the understanding was essentially the greater the truth, the greater the libel. In other words, if you were to say that the royal governor was a Martian, then that may be libelous depending on what you think about Martians, but no one would really believe it. And so it wasn't a serious offense. If, on the other hand, you said the royal governor was stealing land and stealing cows, then that would hurt his reputation. And the job of the journalist was basically to do public relations. So John Peter Zenger was in jail, and this was very serious. British law at the time said the greater the truth, the greater the libel. If it's true, it's worse than if it were false, because more people will believe it, and you'll hurt the reputation of the king or the royal governor. John Peter Zenger's lawyer said, well, no, because the Bible basically says, be a truth teller. And he quoted various prophets, Elijah and others, telling the truth to authority, going up against King Ahab. And he said, this is what John Peter Zenger is doing. He's following biblical principles here, and thus he should not be in jail. The jury listened and then said, Zenger is not guilty. The Chief Justice of the New York Court, appointed by Governor William Cosby, asked the jury foreman, on what grounds do you do this? This is against British law. And the jury foreman just kept repeating, not guilty, not guilty, not guilty, because if he'd actually given a reason, then he would have been shown to be disobeying the law, and he himself would be thrown into jail. That changed American journalism. After 1735, there were no cases brought against American journalism, against American journalists by British authorities for saying something critical of kings or royal governors. That led to the American Revolution. The American Revolution, in a sense, began in 1735. 40 years later, it became military, but it was John Peter Zenger who established the principle of truth-telling based on biblical understanding. And that was American journalism for a time. Now, maybe should I take another couple of minutes and explain what happened? I can do that.
This is fascinating. Yeah, go ahead.
So, in middle part of the 19th century, American Christian journalism became boring journalism. And you see people's diaries where they would say, oh, the Christian Observer has come out. I am obliged to read it. I must read it. It is my spiritual duty to read it. That was not a good thing in journalism. People have to want to read it, and especially when there are competing entertainments of various sorts. A lot of Christian magazines went out of business at that point. And suddenly this whole emphasis on covering both material and spiritual things was gone. And you had a lot of newspapers that just wanted to cover the material. This is the same time American photography began. And the analogy that people made was to photography. You set up a camera, you show what the camera shows, that's the job of the journalist. Not to go beyond that, just to show what the camera shows. Just the facts, ma'am, just what the camera shows. And through the late 19th century, that's what journalism became. And into the 20th century. And then, early in the 20th century, under the influence of a lot of thinkers, including Karl Marx on economics, Sigmund Freud on psychology, Darwin on biology and evolution, people started raising questions. And people started to say, well, this analogy to the camera, that's kind of cute, that's nice, you can understand it, but where do you put the camera? What do you show in the camera? How do you position it? And then it got into questions of, well, what kind of film do you use? What kind of exposure? So it wasn't as simple as just set up the camera and report what you see. People started raising questions. This developed 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. In the 1960s, you had what was called the new journalism, which was highly subjective. Forget this idea of objectivity, the reporter as camera just showing what's in front. It's all a matter of individual opinion. There's no real right or wrong. I mean, the whole idea of a biblical basis was gone. It's going to be a reporter's opinion, and let's face it frankly, and just say it. And here's what I see, here's what I want to see, here's what I think about it. That's journalism. And that became the tendency in American journalism, and in a sense, the whole idea of objectivity was gone, but in some ways that idea of objectivity was too simple. The whole idea of subjectivity became present until the present time, when basically we have different file cabinets. There are my facts, there are your facts, there are her facts, there are his facts. Everyone has a different set of facts. And people are in echo chambers just listening to their own set of facts and discarding what else is going on. So subjectivity rules, objectivity is gone. And the contrast I would make with that is this idea of biblical objectivity. Namely, there is an objective set of things goes on, but the Bible is real, God is real, there are certain principles we can follow. We may disagree on things, we don't want to be just saying, here's what I believe, and we have to listen to other people. We have to try to explain other people's experience, even people who don't agree with us, very diverse people. We need to cover all sorts of things. But still, there is a certain objective reality. It's not all a matter of opinion. It's not my facts and your facts and her facts and his facts. There are some things we can agree upon, and the job of a journalist is to tell the truth. So that's basically my quick history of American journalism and what I think World Magazine and Christianity Today now is really all about. trying to tell the truth, but through a biblical understanding, which is going to be a little different than some other understandings, but not just preaching to the choir, but being able to clearly explain and summarize what a whole lot of people of a whole lot of different beliefs are doing. Now, Tim, tell us about your background, please.
Yeah, well, I'll come to that in just a sec. All
right.
But so there you go. You got a 5-minute crash course in the history of journalism from the 1700s. So, Marvin, you have been a professor of the history of journalism, also a practitioner and a participant in the recent history of journalism. And so it was 29 years for you at World. And I should say, Marvin now actually works at Christianity Today and is our executive editor for News and Global. And so once Marvin had left World, we had the opportunity to begin doing some work together, and then asked Marvin, man, it would be so fantastic if you would come on and help to steward this team and raise up the next generation of Christian journalists. And so it's just been a real pleasure to have Marvin on the team.
It's my, to use a Texas term here, it's my last rodeo. I'm really enjoying it.
And we're honored to be your last rodeo. So let's talk about that recent history of journalism. I think for a lot of us, right, we probably look at the media landscape and it just feels bewildering, right? It's a carnival of lunacy and information and misinformation that's often hard to differentiate. And there are vibrant, highly polarized opinions all competing for attention and so forth. And a lot of us who've been around, I'm looking at the ages of folks in the group. I'm 48, and when I was growing up, there were 3 main television networks. There were a couple newspapers and a couple magazines of national scale, but it was a relatively simple, compared to today, media landscape. Now, it was 1992 when you came to World, or thereabouts?
Yep, became editor, yep.
And so one of the first shifts that you would have had the opportunity to observe as a practicing journalist and after coming to World is the move to online, the rise of online media. And so we're going to come to some other things like the rise of social media and the rise of AI, but I would love to hear first kind of your perspective on how did the rise of online media and that shift to online cause the media landscape to evolve?
Yeah, well, be careful what you wish for. I grew up in Boston, reading the Boston Globe, and then worked at the Boston Globe, and learned a lot, enjoyed it, but there was a certain, it was a moderately liberal publication, and there wasn't a whole lot of diversity of expression. It was very clear where the editors were coming from. I agreed with that. I was part of that. But I wished for more variety and more competition in journalism. So it wasn't just the Boston Globe was and is the leading publication there, but it'd be nice to have more diverse voices of various kinds. And so when I wrote a couple of books on journalism, that's basically what I was calling for. Let's have a lot of variety, let's have different publications. And I was writing at the beginning, back in the late 80s and the 90s, at the beginning of online journalism, and I thought, well, this is great. We're going to have a lot more variety, we're going to have a lot more discussion and diversity and all that. Well, one thing about the Globe that was both bad and good is that there was, again, what was bad is that there wasn't a whole lot of diversity of expression. What was good is they actually had editors, and the editors had very definite standards. And I learned a lot about fact-checking and trying to make sure you got things right and quoted people accurately and get the facts lined up. Do all that checking, be very careful. What happens in online journalism is soon the editors are gone, or every person becomes his own writer, his own editor, and writers need editors need editors. It's always good to have someone checking your work. And what happens increasingly in online, and now especially with Substack and others, very good in lots of ways, but there's no one checking the work. And all kinds of things, some true, some not true. Again, I like the diversity, but also there's a lot of crazy stuff that just goes out there that goes unchecked, and people stating as facts and a lot of people believing it. So now we have these echo chambers, we have people isolated, People watch Fox News and they believe a certain set of things. People watch MSNBC and they believe something else. Never the twain meets. You don't hear the other side. It's hard to make judgments. You just tend to believe and increasingly believe, here's what I'm being told. And sometimes what you're being told is just not true at all. And it's very hard, or it's not hard, it's actually easy to check things, but people fall into various patterns. I always try to advise people whether if they're conservative, read liberal things. If they're liberal, read conservative things. Read radical things, read reactionary things, read widely. But most people don't do that. And as a result, we have these isolation areas, and increasingly people aren't talking with each other, aren't learning from each other, and are suspicious and even paranoid about each other. So that's a huge problem right now. With all the advantages of this diversity, there's just a lot of stuff that goes unchecked, and a lot of libel that goes unchecked, a lot of slander that goes unchecked, and just a lot of craziness, which is, I think, eventually going to be and is now being destructive in lots of ways.
Yeah. Did anybody else grow up watching the nightly news, ABC, CBS, NBC, right? And then I remember what anybody else remember when Rush Limbaugh first kind of began to emerge into the media marketplace, right? And for me, this was just like a paradigm shift. Suddenly, a viewpoint, and my view of that viewpoint would be a little different now. But I will say, when it first came on, it was so refreshing to hear an alternative perspective. Yeah. And so you had kind of this dominance of a relatively small set of media organizations on the national level. And then suddenly you began to have some other voices emerge, like whether that was Rush or Fox News. And for a while there, it was like, well, there's kind of some left-leaning, center-left media organizations, then there are right-leaning media organizations, and then eventually it just gets completely balkanized, right? And it's not just a couple on this side and a couple on that side, but a media landscape where it's not just Fox News, right? There's Fox News, there's Newsmax, there's One American News Network, and kind of these more niche communities that are served by niche media properties, right? So this comes to kind of when I began to get involved in the media landscape. But I'll get your perspective first, and then I'll share mine. But let's talk about the rise of the blogosphere and social media. So I was wrapping up my doctorate and began to engage in this space 2008, 2009. The blogosphere was exploding, social media were exploding, and you talk about the benefit is kind of a democratization. You get to hear voices you didn't hear before, yep. Right? Yep. The detriment is, all right, those voices, there are no gatekeepers anymore, which can be good, and it can also be bad, and less quality control and so forth. How did you at World Magazine experience the rise of social media in particular? And how did that alter what it meant for you to operate that organization?
Well, World was a weekly magazine, became bi-weekly in about 2008. And that made us slow in some ways. I mean, both weekly and then bi-weekly. It's now become a monthly. There are disadvantages to slowness. There are also advantages. We didn't feel obligated to do quick takes, immediately respond to what was going on without necessarily giving it a whole lot of thought. That changed right away. We moved faster, which was a plus, but also a minus in some ways. We had battles at time. We were known for investigative reporting, and we sometimes, the people pushed back, and we had to wait, which in some ways was bad, in some ways was good. We had to consider our responses. We could go back and forth with the parties involved. I mean, right now, it's basically hurling insults back and forth and doing it very, very quickly. Again, advantages, disadvantages, but that certainly changed. It changed the speed. It made it more advantageous in some ways to just give opinions and not do reporting, which again, it's a lot cheaper. You don't have to actually go places. You can just sit in your office and suck your thumb basically and turn out a a statement, attacking someone, and it makes for a much harsher media climate in lots of ways. Again, more fun in some ways. It's in the same way that boxing may be more popular than chess. It's faster. You see people punching each other, but not necessarily thoughtful. So I think that's the overall impact. More fun, less thought, more attacks back and forth, less reasoning together. There are advantages and disadvantages, but it's just a very, very different climate.
Yeah, and I'll share my experience on this. And so, as I was wrapping up my dissertation, this efflorescence of Christian media voices into that online space was taking place. And like I said, the rise of the blogosphere, practically anybody could start a blog at any time, and if their voice was compelling, then they could capture people's attention, they could build a following, and they could build potentially a career out of that, right? And so there were people of goodwill who were entering into that marketplace, and then I think there were people who were out to kind of simply build their own career, even if it cost the people around them. And I had a concern for the future of the Christian voice within that marketplace. And I found that the same topics that I was talking about within philosophy of religion in the academic world were being discussed every day in this kind of out of the ivory tower, in the trenches, everyday conversation that was really shaping and seemed like it was going to be incredibly consequential. And so I became involved in something called in Patheos. And Patheos became really quickly the world's largest forum for conversation on matters of faith. And it did so largely by cultivating this ecosystem of blogs. And so when bloggers picked up a following, then we would bring them over to Patheos and we would help them to grow. And then we would compensate them according to the traffic that they generated. And then with what was left over, then we would have, in theory, our margin, our profit on that. And so it became this incredible sort of laboratory where we had hundreds of blogs. Now, the ones that I invited over into the evangelical channel were largely academics, like a Scott McKnight or a Mark Roberts or a Ben Witherington. But that wasn't the case in all of the channels. And there were some who were really pushing kind of the anger narrative, right? And so we published thousands of pieces a day, and I had access to all of the analytics on that. And what became clear was that the content that traveled the furthest, the content that kind of caught that virality culture as it was just emerging, was content that was instantaneous. So like you say, hot takes, right? You get so much more traffic if you're the first person to comment on something than if you're the 20th, right? And if your compensation is based on your traffic, which it either directly or indirectly is, then the temptation is I need to be the first person to comment. I may not have time to reflect on it deeply and be actually really thoughtful about it, but it doesn't matter. I need to get it out there. So instantaneous, right? Angry and hyperbolic.
Anger sells, yeah.
Anger absolutely sells. And hyperbole sells. It's not okay if, well, this is an unfortunate development. No, this needs to be the end of the world, right? You need to be saying in your headline that this is disastrous for the future of humankind. Things that you could personalize, right? Speaking in the abstract about developments is very different than speaking about an individual, like a Mark Driscoll or something like that, right? If you can personalize things, then you can attract an audience for that. And so it was this remarkable sort of window into the evolving incentive structures of online content. And for me, that was part of why I left Patheos, was I was no longer sure that what we were doing was contributing to the social good. And it seemed like it was a part of just the polarizing forces that were tearing the country apart. And part of why I was interested in coming to CT was that it was a very different model. So Christianity Today is not kind of based on traffic. It has subscribers. It's primarily based on subscribers. And then some of those subscribers are also donors. And so you need people to care about what you're doing and believe in what you're doing, but it's not this kind of imperative that you must increase traffic at all times. That makes us, now we're not totally immune to the temptation to publish things that we know will get a lot of traffic, but it does shift the incentive structures a bit.
Yeah. Yeah, and if your incentive structure is really just based on how many hits, then anger is the thing that's going to make you most successful, which is very different than a biblical ethic. In fact, it's the opposite of the biblical ethic. You could almost say it's an anti-Christian ethic to emphasize anger rather than emphasize learning from each other, loving each other, caring for each other. And in some ways, back in the 1990s, here in Austin, I got very involved with at that time Governor George W. Bush in the development of what became known as compassionate conservatism. And in some ways, that is gone, and perhaps the changing media landscape has contributed to a demise of compassionate conservatism, and in some ways an increase in deliberate cruelty in certain ways, because that also sells. And that's one of the ways in which politics tends to reflect media. It's become a meme almost to say that politics is downstream from culture. I think that's accurate here. And so the changes in the media landscape have led to changes in politics that in some ways I don't think have been healthy.
Yeah, I was approached by a Wheaton undergraduate this past week, and he did an interview with me because he's considering going into journalism. I always wrestle with what to say when people ask me, so, what's your advice for someone who wants to enter into the journalistic space? Because it is so destabilized right now. And the truth is, scorn sells, anger sells. If you are starting out right now and your only intent is to build kind of a nice big revenue stream for yourself, then you should pick one of the extremes, right? It's so much easier to do that work on the extremes. And if we think about the evolution in the last couple decades where you've almost got a kind of flattening out of the political middle and a pressing of more people toward the extremes on the left and the right, this is not a partisan issue, but pulling people toward the extremes, I think the evolution of the media landscape, the rise of virality culture and so forth has been a big part of that.
Yeah, and still I would recommend to any of you or any young people
not to dissuade you, yes.
No, journalism is just so much fun. My one spiritual gift is dog walking. And so I walk often with younger members of my church or other Christians here in Austin around my house for my neighborhood for 2-3 miles or so, and was dog walking this morning with a fellow who's a teacher and wants to be a writer. And he comes from an affluent family, and perhaps his parents would be happier if he were a banker. But he was in business, and he just didn't find that to be fun. And I think that job should be fun. You've probably heard the cliche, if you have a job you love, you'll never work a day in your life. And I worked in a corporation for 5 years, the DuPont Company in Delaware. Came here to UT in 1983, teaching and writing and books and articles and then magazines and things like that. I don't think I have worked a day in my life since 1983. And through the kindness of Texas taxpayers, my kids did not have to go hungry. So I recommend it. It's great. And there are lots of opportunities now. Back when I started teaching at UT, there was one career track. Well, there was a broadcast track and there was a print track. The print track was work at a small Texas newspaper, and if you're good, you can then go work at the Houston Chronicle or the Dallas Morning News. And then if you want to jump from there to the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, you can do that. That was the career track for print. If you were in broadcast, the career track was small station, larger station, larger station. Okay, that worked for a lot of people. Today, it's very different. As Tim was saying, any of you can become your own editor and publisher within several hours. You can do it. Whether you'll find an audience or not, who knows, but you can do it. So it's a whole different media landscape, very exciting in lots of ways, great fun in lots of ways, but I once asked a very successful female freelancer, well, how do you do this economically? And she says, marry a rich husband. So it's hard sometimes to make it financially, but nevertheless, what's life about? Glorifying God, having fun. So there's a thing, to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. Enjoyment begins right now. And so I recommend journalism.
Amen, amen. So let's talk a little bit about the rise of AI. And this is a topic at a number of sessions. And what do you see as the implications of artificial intelligence within the media landscape? How is that changing the media landscape that we're going to inherit in the next 10 years plus?
Well, again, I'd talk about pluses and minuses. Pluses is you can cover things that otherwise wouldn't be covered. For example, local Little League baseball. If you have a community publication, you can have AI, you put a box score in there, and AI will be able to have the names and say who got 3 hits and how many innings did the person pitch and how many runs did he give up, things like that. You can have great coverage like that without having to expend time and money in having a reporter at each game. So things like that are very useful. You can broaden the extent when it comes to basic statistics, basic stories, and things like that. When it comes, however, to news analysis, to actually thinking things through, AI does not do a very good job, and maybe it'll get better, but it does not do a very good job of thinking things through. AI has hallucinations. You can look in search engines, and maybe it's getting better now, and there'll be statements of fact that actually aren't fact at all. Plus, the writing tends to be very clunky. What AI will do is it'll take below average stuff and make it average. It won't take average stuff and make it really good. So far, I haven't seen any great journalism coming out of AI. Now, maybe it'll change, but I think not. I'd be very surprised, because there's a human consciousness involved in combining things, estimating things, analyzing things, that I haven't seen any machine yet been able to approach, and I don't think it will, because there's something we have as human beings. We have bodies, we also have souls, and there's something soulish in writing that I doubt if any machine's going to be able to approach. There may be attempts to make bad writing average, but make average writing good and great. I think not. Again, I may be fooled, I may be surprised, I may be premature, but so far I'd say any publication that relies on AI is going to be at best an average publication and not a good or great publication.
Yeah, one other way that AI is shifting the media landscape right now is its impact on search. And so a lot of media organizations, especially if you're primarily driven by advertising, then you want to attract, of course, the largest audience that you possibly can in order to expose those ads to that audience. And many became quite dependent on social and search. Now, social has already been kind of trending down, as a lot of the major social media platforms have shifted their algorithms. But recently, search engine traffic has dropped pretty precipitously across the media landscape. And that's because you can go to ChatGPT, or you can even go to Google, and it will give you the answer you're looking for without forcing you to go through to any sort of links, right? So you don't have to click through to the links. It's drawing from a lot of media organizations, but you don't actually have to go through to those media organizations in order to get the answer that you're looking for. And so that's happening right now, and that's very real. And for organizations, media orgs that are largely dependent on search traffic, that can be pretty damaging. One note, though, is in some ways, I'm curious to see over the long term whether that might be a good thing. The media properties that are doing the best right now are ones that are really, really focused on subscriptions over advertising. And ones that have a very clear sense of identity, a strong connection between them and their readership, they're the ones that get the subscribers, and subscriptions are just a much more solid source of revenue for those organizations, because you're not dependent on algorithms from Facebook or from Google, right?
Yeah, and this leads me to, Tim, you're not going to be able to evade my questions forever. Okay, I'm a working stiff. I like actually getting my hands dirty, editing, copying, things like that. You're a CEO, big media organization. What's your perspective on these things? How are these trends affecting you and CT?
Yeah, I think that, thanks for asking, and I'll take the question.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the vocation of the Christian storyteller and the Christian truth teller is more vital, more urgent, more necessary than ever. I don't know how many of you have heard of kind of the language of the attention economy, right? There was a book came out recently talking about how attention is the most scarce resource today in the world, and how so many of the things that we're talking about, kind of the rise of news influencers and so forth, is about attention harvesting. How much attention can we harvest? And then how long can we hold it in our hands, right? Keep that engagement so that we can feed more ads and gather more data. And within that landscape, as we're talking about, the truth becomes a sort of counterfeit thing. It's everybody is living within their own informational worlds, where you can find a media source that's just going to confirm your prejudices and presuppositions all day long, right? It's going to confirm your priors. It's not going to challenge you. It's going to tell you, yeah, those people you think are bad, they really are bad, and they're even worse than you thought. And that's a way of grabbing your attention and keeping you engaged, right? Within that landscape, where what is true is called false, and what is false is called true, and what is bad is called good, and what is good is called bad, I think the vocation of the Christian storyteller, the Christian truth teller, the Christian journalist is more necessary than ever. So that is what I got around to saying to that Wheaton undergraduate who was asking about going into this space. It's not easy, but there is a lot of fun to be had along the way, and I think it's more critical than it's ever been before.
Yeah, and really, I'm serious in saying it is a great field to be in. What's life about? Learning things, being curious, being able to go places, meet people you otherwise wouldn't meet, go to places you otherwise wouldn't go to, learn stuff you otherwise wouldn't. This is the job definition of a journalist. So I recommend it to y'all and to any young people you need. Now, at CT then, how do you find good potential journalists?
Yeah, so Marvin has mentored a lot of the present generation of Christian journalists. And I mentioned earlier that Marvin was a part of my story. And so after I got involved at Patheos, I also began to do some work for World. Mm-hmm. And Marvin was my editor. And I remember him telling me that I needed to get over the academic throat clearing. He called it throat clearing. I don't know if that's a phrase that you use often, but it stuck out in my mind. And it's the way that academics can start off an essay, right? Like in some kind of grandiose and ornate sort of way. And here's what I'm going to say. This is the argument I'm going to make. These are my sources. These are all the things that I'm not saying, right? You kind of make people wander through this forest of qualifications and prevarications before you get, and then finally you're like, oh, and here's actually my argument, right? 5 pages in. And Marvin was like, you gotta go right to it. You've got to stop with the throat clearing and just say what you're here to say. And so Marvin has been a big part of mentoring a ton of folks. So a lot of them work at Christianity Today now. We have something like 6 or 7 former World people working at Christianity Today. And I would say I'd be curious for your thoughts on how you find those people. But what I see in this generation is an absolute commitment to telling the truth without fear or favor. You need that. You need people who are going to be willing to say things that are critical of their friends and willing to say things that are kind of their enemies, right? We need to be willing to speak love and truth in all directions. And so as we go forward, we're determined for Christianity Today to be a place that holds open a broad space in the middle for people who want to have a sane Christian conversation, who want solid, trustworthy information. And so far, it feels like people are rallying to the cause, both in terms of readers and in terms of good people to come and work with us.
Yeah, amen.
Amen. Well, why don't we wrap it up there? Thank you, everybody, for your time. Appreciate it.